Start with introducing myself. My name is Motsamai Molefe. I work for the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa. I'm just a researcher there at the center. And welcome to this book launch. Obviously, we're going to have the author of the book, Dr. Bongani Nyoka. Welcome to him. And we're going to have two respondents, Chris Allsobrook, Dr. Chris Allsobrook, Director at the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa, and Mr. Thabang Dladla, our leader, our social analyst, a philosopher at the University of Limpopo. Those will be our respondents. Welcome, gentlemen. We look forward to hearing your responses. And we welcome everyone who has joined us when we celebrate, take a moment to critically reflect on this milestone by our own brother, Dr. Bongani Nyoka. Maybe before we start, we should have some ground rules. If you're not talking, maybe if one person is talking, I know we'd love to see our faces. Maybe it might be progressive if we could switch off our videos and mute our mics. And then, yeah, maybe I think it will be progressive. And the person maybe who will not suffer from that is the man of the hour, Dr. Bongani Nyoka, who will allow him to shine throughout the entire process. And just how this is going to proceed, we're going to start now with Dr. Bongani just giving us a sense of his project, He can do that in any way he deems appropriate. For the coming, say, 10 to 15 minutes at most. And then from there, we will then have the respondents, and then we'll take it from there. Dr. Bongani, thanks a lot, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for the invitation, and also good afternoon to those who have joined this meeting. So this book is divided into 3 sections, all right? Each of which has several chapters. So in total, the book has 7 chapters. But the first section of the book, or the first part of the book, is really a critique of the social sciences, such as understood by Archie Mafeje. The second part is on his work on land and agrarian studies in sub-Saharan Africa. And the third part is on his work on revolutionary theory and politics. So the book is not necessarily, or it's actually far from a biography or a life history of Archie Mafeje. And part of the reason why I put this book together is precisely because of this idea that Mafeje, when people write about Mafeje or talk about Mafeje, in a South African academy at least, they almost always reduce him to his life experiences, his personal encounters and misfortunes, what happened to him at UCT in 1968 and so on and so on. So I've always felt that there was more to Archie Mafeje than that. And he was a well-renowned scholar precisely because of his work and not what happened to him as a person. So that's why I wanted to write a book that would speak to his importance as an intellectual and as a scholar. And so generally, Mafeje wrote on 3 broad areas, as I've divided my book: a critique of the social sciences, his work on land and agrarian studies, and his work on revolutionary theory and politics. So within this first cluster of his work, his critique of the social sciences, I divided into two sections, or into two parts. The thematic and the programmatic, which is a meta-critique of the social sciences themselves, rather than an analysis of particular concepts within the social sciences. I mean, he starts writing in the early 1960s with his mentor and supervisor, Monica Wilson, and together they produce a book on Langa Township. But the book is steeped in liberal functionalism of that period. And he also publishes an article in the same year, 1963, entitled "A Chief Visits Town." And he follows this chief from the Transkei who had visited Langa, the people who live in Langa, and in the hostels. So it's only, but all these publications of the 1960s are not a meta-critique of the social sciences. They are analysis of particular concepts in the social sciences. It's only in 1971 when he publishes his landmark article, The Ideology of Tribalism, where he becomes his own man, so to say, because that article, unlike his previous publications, is not written from a functionalist or a liberal perspective. It's written from a Marxist perspective. So it establishes a radical break with his earlier work. But apart from that, or maybe in spite of that, it is still a critique of a particular concept. It's not a critique of the social sciences, not even anthropology as a discipline. Only in 1976, where he publishes a very important article in his body of work. I mean, it's entitled "The Problem of Anthropology in Historical Perspective." Now, whilst other social scientists, radical social scientists, were concerned to critique the role of the discipline of anthropology in the social sciences, Mafeje said, look, anthropology was in Africa what other social sciences were in Europe. Therefore, there's nothing particularly unique about anthropology. It is imperialist and Eurocentric, just like any other social science. And so what was his solution? His solution was simply this: we need to do away with the social sciences as we know them, because all of them are a product of the Enlightenment period. And so he spoke of this idea of non-disciplinary social sciences, or non-disciplinarity. And he more or less changes the usage of this concept of ethnography. And he uses it in what seems to me to be two ways. One, when he talks about ethnography, he refers to social cultural issues. But then, much more importantly, he uses it as a substitute concept for the social sciences as we know them. And so he says we must learn and generate theoretical insights from the African societies themselves, rather than importing theory to understand African people. And so this inductive approach to the social sciences lays the groundwork or the foundation for his more substantive work on land and agrarian issues and revolutionary theory and politics. So part of what he says with regards to land and agrarian issues is that, I mean, contrary to this popular notion about communal land on the African continent, Mafeje says there is no communal land. as a matter of fact, especially here in South Africa, after the 1927 Quit Rent Act, Black people became tenants of the state. And therefore, land was not owned by communities, but was owned by individual families. So that what I own as my piece of land would be inherited by my children and their children, rather than being owned by the communities as a whole. So that what is owned by communities is not arable plots of land, but grazing fields for livestock. So it makes a distinction between amadlelo and amasimi. Amadlelo being grazing fields for firewood and for livestock, and arable plots of land for individual families. So this speaks to the core of land tenure systems on the African continent. But with regards to the rest of sub-Saharan, he says there is no land question to speak of. There is an agrarian question, because post-independence, the land question was resolved. That's his argument. But the debate between him and other African scholars, such as Sam Moy, was whether there is a land question in Africa in post-independence or an agrarian question. Mafeje seemed to strongly believe that there's no land question in post-independence Africa to speak of. But we've seen a resurgence of land reclamations, land grabs in other parts of the African continent. Kenya is one of those countries where they still have or grapple with the land question. And so, but in any case, this also speaks to issues around whether they are peasants or small producers on the African continent. So in the classical land sense, peasants are petty land owners. And Mafeje says it's not enough to refer to people who live in the rural areas as peasants. They may live there, but they may not own land. Therefore, it's a theoretical as well as a political question as to whether they can legitimately be referred to as peasants. So all of this, is informed by his ethnographic and inductive approach to the social sciences, which is learning from the African societies themselves. So this spills over, obviously, to his work on revolutionary theory and politics, where, for example, here in South Africa, the popular notion of South Africa being a colony of a special time, Mafeje says this was an unwarranted relativism, which seeks to isolate South Africa, not just from other parts of the African continent, but also from other settler colonies in other parts of the world, so that there's nothing unique about South African colonialism to the point that South Africa can be referred to as a colony of a special time. What we have, he says, is that South Africa was a case of racial oppression in the age of imperialism. That was his diagnosis of the South African society. So these are some of the issues that I try to tackle in the book, and so just in the broadest of strokes, I'll leave it there and hear what my discussants have to say.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for giving us that brief reflection on the book. You've touched very important themes. Particularly the idea of non-disciplinary social sciences and that use of the idea of ethnography. I think it's a very, very interesting idea. But I will leave it. I won't get into that. I will then ask Dr. Allsobrook to give us his response to. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for giving us an account of your book. I must say I've been enjoying this. I only got this on Friday, but I've been reading it ever since. So for the last quite a long time, I've been immersed in Mafeje and your book, and it's been very good to look back at some of these debates, which I think have been neglected in this country for some time, despite the urgency of this discourse of decolonization. And so it's good to see you've been digging deep into our intellectual resources of African intellectual resources, and specifically of South African intellectuals. And so I wanted to talk perhaps a little bit about some of the ideas in your book, maybe just ask you about a couple of them, a few of them, which Thabang will also look into. But one thing I liked was that, which maybe you didn't address much, was the role of the social critic. And you do hint at some point where you talk about Mafeje's account of the Imbongi. And I was wondering if perhaps you thought that perhaps Mafeje, in a way, is an Imbongi, or if he sees the role of the critic in those terms, or if there's anything perhaps useful from the tradition of social critique in the practices of the Imbongi that we could take to analyze, characterize the kind of work that he's doing and the kind of critique that might be relevant in the African context and in social criticism. There was an important, obviously, it's very important, his account of the tribe as ideology. But I don't want to dwell too much on that because I think you've covered it very well. However, I did notice that you made quite a strong distinction between democratic pluralism and cultural pluralism. And in fact, you criticized Mafeje.
It's fucked up. It doesn't configure earphones. It doesn't.
Someone's interrupted.
It's strange.
Anyway, Mafeje is, you say in a way he's naive to think that democratic pluralism will erode tribal jingoism. And what's needed more is a kind of cultural pluralism. I was hoping perhaps you could make more something of that distinction between democratic pluralism, which Mafeje was naive to overvalue, and why cultural pluralism is different and preferable. I think it's quite an important point in South Africa, at least today. And another theme that I think is quite important is the idea of the epistemic break. I don't think it seems it's not just relevant in terms of the break from Western theory, but it's also relevant in terms of speculation over the telos of emancipatory struggle. What can we speak of that goes beyond history in terms of the future? What prognosis can be made? It seems there's very similar questions for the question of an epistemic break with Western theory, because Mafeje was concerned to break radically from the tradition he'd been schooled in. And similarly, in his prognoses about where we should be going, what is the point of the struggle, where should we be heading, it also raises the question, how can you make a radical break with the prior traditions without succumbing to reformism? Of course, as a white middle-class man, I'd want to advocate reformism, but but it's just I just thought it was quite interesting that there's this continuing problem of from whence the Aufhebung, the radical break, or just a reconciliation of existing historical contradictions? How can you break free of these historical contradictions? And is there any such transcendence? So that's actually a big fat question. I think that covers quite a lot of the issues. And it's a question of form that applies both to the third part of your book and the first part of your book. On the, sorry, I don't want to take up too much time here, but another issue I thought was quite important that you raised was it was a bit ambiguous, you know. You say that Mafeje is critical of this kind of Thabo Mbeki dual nations story, right? Which comes up in a number of social theorists. You might even say in Mahmoud Mamdani, you've got the citizen and the subject, yeah, as well. And there's this constant dualism in a lot of analysis of social problems in South Africa specifically, which posits a big distinction between the formal and the informal, such that rights are only predicated for formal citizens and the subjects are neglected. But Mafeje criticizes that dualism. And it seems he makes it from a point of dialectical analysis, saying, for instance, that you can't quite tell. He says in Langa he was interviewing the same people in Cape Town as he was when he went back to the Transkei, you know, so it complicates that duality. But is there anything to that duality at all, or is it something to be discarded? Is it some kind of continuum? I was just wondering about that, because the problem is, as you mentioned, of a schizophrenic gap in South Africa between the communal black and the individual title deeds bourgeois citizen. So it does seem there's a duality, but at the same point, there's a constant, sometimes they're the same people. Okay, Bongani, I think I best stop there. I have way too many questions, so I don't want to hog time. I'll leave you just with those questions, and then also we can, Thabang will take over from me. But anyway, thank you again for this excellent analysis.
Thank you, Chris. I don't know, Bongani, uphendula Chris, or should I bring in Thabang?
Let me try to respond now.
Okay, then you will respond, then Thabang will come later. Thanks, Chris, for those questions.
Well, on the idea of Imbongi as a social critic, and Mafeje's main argument is that, look, contrary to the popular notion that Imbongi is a praise singer, you know, that is someone who sings the praises of the king or the chief or whatever social institution. Imbongi, as far as he understands it, based on his ethnographic work in the Transkei, it performed the role of the critic rather than someone who celebrated the kings with supine adulation. But obviously, he makes a distinction between three kinds of intellectuals. You have the complacent intellectual, who is your mainstream intellectual and sings the praises of the status quo. And then you have what he calls Shanghaied intellectuals. These are intellectuals whose discourse is informed by their funders. They are otherwise radical or well-intentioned, but their discourse is necessarily limited because they pander to the views of the funding agencies. And then the third and most important category is that of a transcendent intellectual. These are people whose ideas are shaped by the society from which they come. Obviously, he is influenced to a very large extent by Gramsci as well as Fanon. But he acknowledges, of course, that every social or political institution will always have its legitimizers. He does not deny that. Does not deny that Imbongi can be a praise singer, but that is not the central or the core function of Imbongi. The central or core function of Imbongi is to perform social and political analysis. That's his main argument. Can he be categorized as Imbongi? Well, to the extent that you understand Imbongi as a social-political critic, then yes, I guess one could say that. But Mafeje is not a poet, and therefore his discourse is largely informed by research, and he was speaking mainly to his peers, fellow academics. So I would be reluctant to call him Imbongi, but to the extent that Imbongi is a social political critique, maybe one could say that. On the idea of tribalism as ideological, well, Mafeje says four things about the idea of tribe and tribalism. He says the ideology of tribalism is Eurocentric in the sense that it was invented by European powers to divide and conquer the African continent. Second, it was supported by colonial anthropologists insofar as they used the idea of tribalism and tribes to explain conflicts on the African continent. He says it's also used by African leaders themselves for their own ends. But to the extent that African people, ordinary African people, come to believe in the idea of tribalism, it is ideological in a Marxist sense. So it is false consciousness, because there are no innate differences amongst African people, except for those which were invented by colonizers and further perpetuated by African leaders. So those are some of the core issues to this argument around tribe and tribalism. But it does not reject the idea of the entity of tribe as being non-existent. He simply says that it's outdated, it's anachronistic, in the sense that African ethnic groups are not politically, economically, and socially bound as anthropologists presented them. There's always been intermingling, cross-cultural, and also linguistic interaction amongst the African people. Social linguistics might have something to say about this. The cliques in the Xhosa language as being heavily influenced by the Khoi languages, for example. So anyway, on the idea of cultural and democratic pluralism, I'm not sure if I do say that Mafeje is naive in talking about these issues. What I am saying is that democratic pluralism has been used, especially in cases such as Kenya, for example, where politicians divide even the very provinces or regions of the country along linguistic and ethnic lines. And so democratic pluralism in that sense may not work, or has been proven to be problematic in other parts of the African continent. And in any case, this idea does not, it simply flies in the face of his own socialism, that is Mafeje's, insofar as it it panders to liberal ideological discourses. And so the idea of cultural pluralism itself has been discredited by Mafeje's contemporaries, such as Bernard Makubane and others. And so he does not make a clear distinction between the two. And I'm the one who tries to push him a little further and say, where exactly does it draw a distinction between cultural and democratic pluralism? So on the idea of epistemic breaks, Mafeje wanted, this whole idea of non-disciplinary social science was informed by this idea of epistemic break and new knowledge systems on the African continent. But he'll be the first to admit, or maybe to caution, against throwing the baby with the bathwater and say that all knowledge from Europe is irrelevant to the African continent. He was, after all, a Marxist. And one of the things that he says in his paper, 1976 paper, The Problem of Anthropology in Historical Perspective, was that a non-disciplinary social science will have to be Marxist social science. It's only in the 1990s that it became to change this idea because of his Africanist critics who said, but this is no different from what other European social scientists have been advocating. Hence, he moved to this idea of ethnography as a substitute for social sciences as we know them. So for him, knowledge is still cumulative in spite of his call for an epistemic break. I don't think such a break, based on what he says anyway, would be completely pure and clean without any influences from Europe and North America or from other parts of the world. He learned a great deal, for example, from theorists such as Mao Zedong and Lenin, and he says that part of their genius was that they contributed to Marxist theory by bringing to bear their concrete social and political realities to theory. And that's how they were able to come up with their own brands of Marxism, which was Leninism and Maoism. And so such a break, no matter how hard we try as African researchers, I don't think it would be completely clean and pure without any influences from other parts of the world. On the idea of dualisms or dual theories of economic growth, this is, Mafeje's critique really was that the informal and the formal sectors of the economy are not binary opposites or are not polar opposites. They are a dialectical dynamic. So there is a continuum. He says that we cannot think of the formal outside of the informal, so that the two inform one another in a dialectical way. So you can never have, he says, an informal sector without the formal sector supervening or dependent on the informal. So they are not completely, they are not complete polar opposites. Instead, they are a continuum. Yeah, so I think I should leave it there and take questions from Thabang.
Thank you, Dr. Bongani. I think, Chris, if you still want to come back, we'll open another session. For now, let's allow Thabang to come through and throw in his work. I remember your master's was on Mafeje as well, Thabang.
Yeah.
And your doctoral thesis on Mafeje as well.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, Mafeje scholars can engage each other. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Brother Bongani for finally, like producing the book. I think where it is located, particularly since the events of 2015, like with the Rhodes Must Fall, like uprisings, like there has been this call for decolonization, and which has, haunted like the South African Academy. I mean, he does point out, like in the book, that before then, like, in the 80s and 90s, South African academics were talking about reform. And somewhere in the 90s, they were talking about transformation, while others were talking about Africanization. But that this decolonization discourse has gained more traction. And this book seeks to contribute towards those discourses. I think, he does note how this call for decolonization has not transcended the call and to the actual business of decolonization, and actually sets out what decolonization ought to be, and which is tapping into the African knowledge archive, which would then lead me to this, to this question. I mean, is it possible for such a project to actually transcend those European limitations? Because I mean, the African Knowledge Archive, I mean, at least like post, independence, has been to a large extent influenced by Marxist thinking. So in a way, I mean, what Mbembe calls Afro-radicalism, thinking around like, the political economy, and, in a way they've been deterministic. So, I mean, Mafeje, I mean, as you say, did live this, bifurcated existence between, his Marxist, ideas from the unity movement and, the functionalist liberal, anthropology that he was engaged with. And then at some point, like there was that break, in the 1971 article, as you say, and, like they said, like the, following articles. But then that in the 90s, because of his Africanist, detractors, I mean, he began to revise. So I think this is, in a way where the conversation is at. I mean, can Marxist categories help us, decolonize in a way? Is tapping into the African Knowledge Archive really entailing that critique of Eurocentrism? I mean, given this, heavy Marxist influence, I mean, to what extent can we say Mafeje, transcended, like this, such Marxist entanglements? Because, I mean, since, the Latin American school, I mean, the decoloniality discourses, like there has been this, preoccupation with the critique of Marxism and, its Eurocentric entanglements, and that, some African intellectuals have not been able to transcend, such limitations. And, for some South African intellectuals, the Latin American route seems to be like, like the viable option, because it doesn't have, such contradictions. And yeah, I mean, just in like trying to, I mean, I see where the book is located with regards to the current discourses of decolonization. And I think, it makes a valuable contribution because, it seeks to read African, intellectuals from within, like not in like not as them offering the experience to be analyzed and interpreted from imported theory, but then now looking from within. I mean, what do we say about such like Marxist preoccupations?
Yeah, thanks, man. That's a good question. But you see, I think this has become a controversy in Mafeje's discourse. This idea of Marxism and Africanism, particularly his work of the 1990s. Let me say at the outset that Mafeje was always a Marxist. I mean, up to the very end. If you read his 2003 monograph on access to land and peasant responses, that's a Marxist discourse. What he was trying to do was to move away from this dogmatic approach and mechanistic approach to Marxist theory, which imports theory and try to understand African societies. If the theory doesn't fit, then there's something wrong with the African society rather than the theory itself. So his approach, as I've always been saying, was inductive in the sense that he was learning from the African societies themselves to inform theory. I'm not sure. I don't think I can answer the question as to whether it's. I think it's too big for me to be able to give a satisfactory answer as to whether African intellectuals or researchers can fully transcend the European archive or the European canon. I think Mafeje himself has learned a great deal from. I mean, even in his landmark study, the theory and ethnography of African social formations, he admits that, listen, in as much as I critique the works of colonial anthropologists, I've learned a great deal from them. And therefore, this critique is not a rejection as such of knowledge from Europe and North America. It is simply to say we need to read Africa from inside outwards. So does that entail a complete rejection or a complete transcendence of the European archive? I don't know, man. I don't know.
Thank you, Thabang. Do you want to come in quickly? Thabang or Chris, does anyone of you want to come in quickly before we open for the audience? Thanks a lot, Thabang, for that question. It's an interesting question. But maybe while we're still trying to open for everyone, maybe the question that I wanted to throw in, it's a small one, is how do we learn from inductively? How do we learn from African people? How do we learn? I mean, as an intellectual, I come into a space and I've been trained in Western ways of thinking, you know, and now I'm saying, no, I want to put a pause on this influence. What epistemic posture do I take? Do I become tabula rasa? How do I manage myself as an agent, as a thinker, that I'm not influenced by theoretical frameworks? As I look into this lived experience, how do I rid myself of the presuppositions, pre-existing theories, the influence I come with of having lived in a post-colonial society? How do I rid myself of that so that I am reading the African situation?
I don't know if Mafeje himself could have entered any social space with that tabula rasa that you are referring to. What he did, which I think was genius, particularly in that book on the theory and ethnography of African social formations, is that it was in the context of a search for a pre-colonial African mode of production. And traditionally, Marxists were saying pre-colonial Africa, just like Europe, was feudal. And Mafeje was saying, but the land question on the African continent before colonialism was slightly different in the sense that the African people were not land bound, and land itself was not considered property. Of course, there was exploitation, but there was no vessel and landlord type of relations. And therefore, the type of exploitation which obtained in pre-colonial Africa was such that people were paying tributes to kings and chiefs. And therefore, far from being a case of feudalism, because there was no feud between ordinary people and the chiefs based on the land question. Africa, before colonialism, was a case of a tributary mode of production. So I'm using this as an example to explain some of the theoretical insights which are informed by data from the African continent itself. He's not necessarily talking about going and interviewing people and finding out how they think or what they think about their own societies, but really taking seriously what you see before your eyes and critique theory using, I don't want to use the word evidence, but in the absence of a better word, and use evidence to critique theory, which makes universal claims, even when they do not fit. So that's different from saying that you enter social spaces without having any influences. But I think what's important is being able to critique theory itself.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. Answered. If there are hands, I want to give to our. Maybe I'll give Thabang and Chris at the end for the closing remarks. For now, I just want to open for people who might have questions. I saw a hand. Was it Olwami? Olwami? Thanks, Olwam. Go for it.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Dr. Nyoka. I must confess that I have not really been able to follow your book discussions. I've seen it a couple of times, and it's only now that I'm able to follow. And to my surprise, and maybe not surprise, maybe pleasure, that I would have someone to sort of read through, because I came across an article, the master's report, Mafeje, in 1963.
Yeah.
And he was comparing two villages, Engcobo.
Yes.
All Saints. Yes. I just forgot the other one. Kubenga, yes. And I'm trying to learn for my masters. I'm trying to build an argument that there is a reason that you have so many leaders coming from the Eastern Cape who are closer in the sense. And I'm trying to search for any artifacts, any cultural, stimuli or whatever it might be that might make people who are coming from this region in the world be prone to leadership. And as we know, the people don't want to call all the names of the political leaders that we've had and others. So I wanted to find out, in your studying of Mafeje, other than that book, other than that master's thesis, does he continue to discuss the notion of leadership from this region? Because as we are building the African leadership scholarly work, and Africa has all these countries, about, 54 or so, I suspect that there is maybe a principle or two that we, as the Xhosa people from this end, would actually contribute in the continental port before we can then have an overall umbrella African leadership discourse.
No, Mafeje does not return to those questions of leadership in the Eastern Cape in his work. I remember when he was doing, I came across a letter he wrote to Monica Wilson. I think he wrote the letter in 1969 or 1970, I can't remember the date, where he says he wants to take his data, the data that he used for his MA thesis, and write a comparative study of the Eastern Cape and some parts of Uganda, because he had done his field work for his PhD thesis in Uganda. But he never produced such a study where he writes a comparative study of the Eastern Cape and an area called Buganda in Uganda. So as far as I know, he does not return to questions of leadership, particularly in the Eastern Cape. And I think part of the reason he never done that was because he resisted the idea of writing about any area on the African continent without familiarizing himself. He knew that, I mean, he spent a lot of time in exile. He lived in Egypt for, I think, 27 years. So in some ways, he had lost touch with what was happening in the Eastern Cape. And I don't think he would have ventured to go and tackle those issues, even though he had been outside of South Africa for such a long time. Part of what he wanted to do when he returned to South Africa in the 2000s was to revisit these questions of South African historiography. But I guess he was ill, and maybe also he didn't have the energy to continue doing such work. So no, that master's thesis is the only publication I'm aware of where he deals with the question of leadership in the Eastern Cape.
Thanks all for that. Thanks, Olwami. Any other questions from our? Any other questions?
Can we come in?
Who wants to come in?
It's me, Bundu.
Come, my brother. Don't be afraid.
Okay. My question is, it's been something that has really been occupying my mind, and someone from a history department and background. I've always wanted a resolution of, how betterment is related in discourse in the land and agrarian, considering how, even land sort of tenure systems sort of changed, and how people related to land, and and subsequently to that, even in the academia, how people have made sense generally of betterment in relation to the peasant question as well. So I don't know how better to phrase this question, but I would like to know how betterment could be fit into discourse in the land and agrarian discourse, considering how also other questions of the people pre-betterment were peasants or not, and post-betterment whether they were small, because it was a thing where they had to make use of the land how they see it, and how also they disturb sort of the program itself, because where they used arable lands or grazing lands for housing, and in some instances and it was categorized as housing. It was used for grazing land. So I would like to know from Dr. Nyoka that how could we possibly fit betterment into the land and agrarian discourse, given that historical process. I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
I'm not sure if I fully understood, but I mean, one of the arguments that Mafeje makes, particularly with regards to this land question, was that the land question cannot be limited to agricultural activities or even the rural areas. It goes beyond that. The current housing crisis in South Africa, for example, is a classic example of the land question. And so Mafeje would never limit the land question to agricultural activities. But I think you're using the concept of this idea of betterment as a particular historical, not just activity, but as a concept. I don't think I fully understood you there. Could you just explain what you mean by it?
I'm referring to betterment planning that was passed in 1939.
Mm-hmm. So yes, I mean, as I say, I mean, the land question can't be limited to agricultural activities. I mean, if there are other things that people decide to do with the land when they get it, then that's even better. I mean, what's important is that land should be returned to those who rightfully own it, and I think that would be Mafeje's claim. In fact, that is his point of departure. All the other theoretical insights that he generates proceed from the fact that land has to be returned to those who own it.
Mm-hmm. So I think for me, it's to sort of historians. I'm saying from what I'm getting from your response is that this is a challenge to sort of historians to also think about how they frame and write about that betterment planning scheme.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of opens up to agriculture, where there's a much more sort of important question that is the land question, and perhaps it's also something that I'll sort of try to see if how can I best articulate it in my work as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, Mafeje's, I think, main contribution for me, anyway. I mean, his claims were not just based on historical detail, but they were also epistemic because he was making conceptual interventions on how we should frame and understand some of these historical developments, especially even on the land and agrarian questions. So it is something for you to think about as a historian. Yes.
Thank you. I think I don't know if there are no other hands. I would love to give maybe Thabang, Chris, to make their final inputs. I've noted maybe before they come in, maybe before Chris you come in, we could give President Oud a chance, and then you'll come in afterwards.
Thanks, colleagues, and thanks for an fascinating conversation. Dr. Nyoka, just a question as a sociologist. but finding myself in a development studies department right now in Alice here in Fort Hare. I've been reading back on conversations and intellectuals and the public engagement of intellectuals in a book project on South African sociology and Bourouoi's idea of public sociology, which I know you've also criticized. It's one of the reasons why I came across your work and started to read what you're producing, and I am astounded by the lack of engagement with the work of people like Mafeje and Makubane within the sociological canon in South Africa. And I'm referring now to the curriculum specifically. Added to that, Mkai, Solplaiki, etc. And I know both Jimmy Adesina and Kolela Mangoof have both been working to change this landscape. What is your, I mean, you've published this book now, and judging from the response, what is the willingness of the sociological community and maybe the social scientific community more broadly to address issues of curriculum and the historical silencing of these voices in the way we teach?
That's an interesting question. I just examined a thesis from one of the South African universities, and the candidate there writes exactly about these issues, and he finds that actually the reception, even after Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, has not been very warm. I mean, it has been individual lecturers or professors who have been interested in teaching works from places other than Europe and North America. But, and this is a case study of two Gauteng-based sociology departments. But for me, I think, I mean, you and I are sociologists by training, and we always gravitate towards big questions. Now, for me, I think an interesting theoretical and I guess political question would be, is it possible to, never mind decolonize, but to transform curriculum in a society that is not itself fully transformed? What's important for us to think about is that when we enter the university spaces, we are members of society primarily. And therefore, I think it would be positivistic. And we all know that the idea of positivism has been discredited by theorists such as Mafeje and Makubane, whom we mentioned. So we enter intellectual spaces with our socio-political baggages. And I'm not sure if at this point South Africa is ready to, South African intellectuals are in a space where they can fully engage or even take up some of the issues that I've raised even in my earlier work about the discipline of sociology vis-a-vis curriculum. So it's actually a very big question to ask, political and also intellectual, whether we can have a transformed or decolonized curriculum in a society that is not fully transformed or decolonized. So the reception has been quite cold, I think. There was an excitement during the Fees Must Fall, or maybe shock on the part of some South African intellectuals and academics, but very little has been done about this. You know, that is transforming and decolonizing the curriculum. Even in the discipline of sociology alone, never mind other disciplines.
Chair, can I follow up?
Yes, quickly.
in my own attempts to find texts to prescribe, for instance, if you want to teach Saul Plaatje alongside Du Bois, who writes at the same time as Weber and Durkheim, I find it particularly hard to identify a text of Plaatje that could work as a sociological text. Now, I think a lot of that work hasn't been done to turn South African and African thinkers in the discipline of sociology into prescribable texts. And I think this is why I appreciate the publication of your book, because you do a lot of work. I mean, obviously students should read the original, but we know for a first-year class that often doesn't work, and there's work that needs to be done, like Marx was turned into a sociologist, to turn him Kai and Plaatje into the kinds of texts that would speak to these kinds of questions. So I'm more optimistic than you are. I just think we need to do a lot of work in order to bring it about, and maybe it's because I work in a transformed space which is Fort Hare, which I find profoundly liberating. But yeah, thanks for that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Chris, Thabang, respectively, if you could share your final input.
Sorry, Motsamai, could we maybe make space for Tozamile, who has asked a question just before?
Where's Tozamile? I didn't see that.
I see someone, Tozamile7@gmail.com, has a hand up.
I didn't see that.
Yes.
Oh.
I know.
Yeah.
You didn't see the ball.
The ball. Sorry, man.
I know. Hey, Bo. No, that's fine. That's fine. Thanks, Bo. Hello to everyone, with colleagues and friends, and also to you, Dr. Nyoka. It's quite interesting to finally get to meet the famous man, so to speak, because arriving in Pretoria, there's been some talks about the great work that you are doing. I have a question that we are also dealing with a few friends of mine, such as Thabang and perhaps Sabelo as well, especially with the question of the decolonial pole, or at least trying to decolonize our curriculum. Now, I was maybe wondering what could be the best principle of, to our grounding, the best principle towards our grounding of our decolonial pole. Why I ask this question is because, as we are seeing, or at least we see with Black intellectual scholars, they are also influenced by the West. So the way they would write, perhaps, will be informed by how they were taught and all sorts of things. And this comes to us as well, as young scholars trying to also, bring up this question of the decolonial pole and to try to, excavate the discourse, right, on decolonization. Now, one of the things that, I'm skeptical about, which also Tommy Kari sort of, put a skepticism on Black scholars who are influenced, by the West, and that there could be perhaps what we can call, Black scholars that perpetuate the colonial fabric in our discourses on Africa or even on decolonization, which then, because I'm also struggling with this question, because my supervisor keeps on telling me, well, in as much as I'm doing this work, but nonetheless, I fall within what Tommy Kari's critique about Black scholars who are engaging, even if it is based on the decolonial code. So perhaps maybe you can shed light, as to how can we go about it, especially also with regards to creating our curriculum and developing our curriculum, where perhaps departments can focus on, Africanity, or the,
being Afrocentric and all sorts of things. But if you look into the scholars that are there or that are being taught, these Black scholars also have some form of influence from the West. So maybe this question also goes to what Thabang has asked: can we actually, escape, this link with the West? But I just thought that perhaps there's a better understanding or a better way of doing the decolonial call, so that we do not become also, Black scholars that keep on perpetuating, this colonial rule or, the colonial fabric in our academics. So I would like to hear from you what you think, my brother. Thank you.
I was going to say that your question is related to Thabang's, but also in some ways to Andres' question. But part of what African intellectuals that I'm interested in have always been saying is that critiquing the European canon is not necessarily to substitute and to erase the erasure that has been perpetuated by European intellectuals and to substitute it with an African erasure. And so you would find that, for example, intellectuals such as Mafeje, Bernard Makubane, Samir Amin, all of these guys were heavily influenced by Marx. It's really a big question as to whether we can completely transcend the European canon and start afresh without having any influences from it. I'm not sure if such a project is possible or whether it can happen at this point in time or even in our lifetime. I really don't know. But I would be interested. I mean, I read Tommy Curry's book, Men Not. I haven't engaged with his work on this issue that you're raising. And I would be interested in his own solution, because from what I'm getting from you is that he's critiquing Black intellectuals for relying on the Euro-American canon, but what's his own solution? I'll be interested in that as well. So I don't have a satisfactory answer to your question. Hello? Are we still?
Yeah.
Motsamai?
Yes, I'm still here. I spoke without switching on the
Can I hear from Tozamir
Tos, you still want to come back, but I think the point that is emerging here is that there's supposed to be an important conversation about how to relate with the Western Euro-American archive and what ought to be the positionality of those in Africa and African scholars in relation to that. And then there are serious debates about whether we can transcend it or how to negotiate academic intellectual work in relation to it, in trying to think about Africanization and decolonization. So I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation, and I want to, unless Tos has got a burning issue that he wants to throw in, I would prefer to go to Chris and Thabang for their closing remarks.
Just one line from Tozamir about Tommy Curry.
Yes, just one line. Just one line.
Okay. Here is the chance to give a line.
No, just one line. Tommy Curry, there are two articles that he writes, but one is on method and derelict, right? Or derelict on method, whatever, right? Where he poses this question of, what is critical race theory, So that's his theory that he develops, and in its development, he by all means he's very critical of any individual who is interested in the question of race. That does not necessarily take into account, its genealogical and also its implication into politics and the lived experience of the Black individual. So it's a very intense, at least for now, because I'm still also engaging with it. But it's a very intense, and I'm trying by all means to understand the implications that he comes up with and so forth. But I think it's a really good read. And yeah, he centers the Black experience though.
Okay, thanks. I'll look for the article.
Thanks. Maybe Charles, you should share the articles with us somehow, but we can engage on that privately. This Hare person is emerging in different circles. Maybe he should be visited. But for now, thanks for that. Maybe we should move to the two brothers.
Can I go first before Chris? Then Chris can just close.
Sure, for sure.
Go for it, my brother. Do not be afraid.
Yeah. I mean, I think Brother Bongani has answered my concern. I mean, with regards to ideas and how like they are socially located. That this is not something happening in the sky, but this is, I mean, ideas are a product of a society, and that we cannot have decolonized ideas in a colonized society. I mean the concern for me, which also inspired like my own reading of Mafeje, has been like that his engagement with Eurocentrism, particularly through like Marxist categories. Although I try to see him as someone who is trying to at least transcend like that Marxist thinking. I mean, particularly in his essays on African philosophy, and like the controversial Africanity article that I would like you to comment on. I mean, I think I think
man. You like
no, I mean, like I don't think like we can conclude a discussion of Mafeje without engaging that like that article, particularly the concerns it raises with regards to African American critical theory, or like political thought, and like that intellectual tradition in relation to the like the African archive. But I mean, I understand him to be thinking through Marx in order to make sense. I mean, it is true, like as you have said, that it's impossible to come into the world tabula rasa, that being born into a society, receiving a particular training also influences the ways in which you think about things and how you relate to phenomena. And I think also, I mean, all of us are equally guilty. I mean, not really, but I mean, like, we're just in this, like, it's not something we can escape. And I mean, which also explains why we're having this conversation in English now. I mean, you also point out, like in the book, that there has been these engagements, that this is something that is not new, right? That whatever that is new is not brilliant. So in a way, like, we have seen, like since 2015, people treating, such discourses as, like, wow, this is new. Oh, Ramon Grosspiegel has said this. Nelson Maldonado Torres, 1492, 5 men of 5 countries, without actually, I mean, engaging the African, intellectual work, which to a certain extent did influence, like the Latin American thinking. I mean, Dussel, draws some inspiration from Nkrumah, for instance, but for some South African intellectuals, it's better to go to Dussel than to go to Nkrumah for inspiration. And I think like we can't ignore Marx. We can't ignore Marxism and the influence it has had, on on society, and also in the ways in which we think about society. And I think Mafeje himself, being a progressive intellectual in that sense, I mean, Marxism is a progressive, philosophy of society, in that in its critique of liberal idealism and like the capitalist mode of production. But there is that sense in which we can try to see Mafeje as this African intellectual. I mean, of course, African intellectualism has to engage Eurocentrism as part of its practice necessarily, and also to have this positive project. So like there's that negative project and the positive project, which I think is what he was getting at, with his ethnography, and also like this I mean, his methodology. But just to touch on like the whole African American influence and Afrocentrism, there's a like that passage where he says Afrocentrism made in America is a contradiction in terms, and that I know we have had discussions about this and how like that is somewhat not on, but I think there is a way in which he's speaking against intellectually imperialism. I mean, in the philosophy scene, for instance, I mean, this has been interesting in that, I mean, South African intellect a Charles Mills or a Lewis Gordon, for instance, than to engage philosophers from the continent. So in a way, like like there is a way in which African American intellectualism pacifies voices from the continent, like in a way that erases like these contributions. That if you want to think about race, if you want to think about society, I mean, you can't think Mafeje, like rather look at Gordon, rather look at Mills and what these guys have been doing. And I think, I don't know, I mean, like this is like really controversial. I'd just like to I just want to hear your view.
I think my position vis-a-vis that article. For those who don't know, it's Africanity, a combative ontology. Part 2 of that article is Africanity, a commentary by way of conclusion. The first one was published in 2000, and the second one was published in 2001. Both articles by Archie Mafeje. I think I suppose, I mean, maybe I've been too critical of that article and perhaps even harsh, but I feel that if you read Mafeje's work in its totality, you'd find that there's nothing particularly new in that article. And I suppose the most important message is that African intellectuals have to read the African continent on its own terms, and produce knowledge such as African peoples know, and not import theory in order to understand the African continent. For me, that is something that Mafeje has been doing since the beginning of his career. And so he does not, there is an interesting article where he engages Black intellectuals in the diaspora. It's called The Africanist Heritage and Its Antinomies. It was published 10 years before the Africanity paper, and I think that's a much more theoretically sophisticated article by Mafeje on these very questions. And there's something, in my view anyway, regressive about the Africanity article, especially as it relates to Black people in the diaspora. I mean, Pan-Africanism ab initio, from the beginning, was about a unity that can be forged between Africans on the continent and Africans outside of the African continent. And for me, the minute that Mafeje tries to break these ties and state what I take to be a platitude, that Africans in the diaspora no longer have these cultural connections between Africans and the African continent, he loses my sympathy immediately, because what's important is to go back to the root cause of such a disjuncture between Africans here and Africans in the diaspora. And so once you simply blame African Americans and those in the Caribbean for condescending to Africans here, we have to understand why that is the case. And outside of such an understanding, for me, Mafeje's critique of African American intellectuals become superficial. And secondly, I mean, it is our reception of the works of African Americans. It is us who put them on this pedestal. I don't think that Louis R. Gordon comes to South Africa uninvited, for example. We are the ones who take his work seriously, so seriously, in fact, that we tend to ignore the works of African intellectuals on the continent. And so the debate amongst Pan-Africanists for a very long time has always been whether Pan-Africanism should be limited to Africans on the continent, or whether it should be extended to those outside of the continent. Those who have advocated the view that Pan-Africanism should be limited to Africans on the continent have always been regarded conservative and regressive, because that's not Pan-Africanism, but continentalism. And I think that's what Mafeje's argument amounts to in that paper on Africanity. And so I have no sympathy with him there at all. But I understand some of the issues that you would like to rescue Mafeje there nonetheless. But for me, I don't think that he says anything that he hasn't said before in that article, except of course for this reactionary position of rejecting Africans in the diaspora.
Reactionary.
It's a reactionary discourse, man. Come on.
Thanks. Chris, you want to jump in as well?
Thank you. Thanks, colleagues. I do want to just say a few things here towards the end, also that I didn't mention when I was asking some questions. I won't ask questions, however. I thought perhaps I'd just give a quote from the book, which is actually a quote from Mafeje on page 202, where he writes, in the context of domination, universal languages are a supreme instrument for indoctrination, and in the context of liberation, vernacular languages are a powerful instrument for self-assertion and self-rediscovery. Now, my ability to grasp vernacular languages is very poor, unfortunately, apart from my own vernacular English. But I would, however, just like to mention some of the distinct and exceptional African characteristics that you point to in this book, which I think extend far beyond the categories of European science and models. And just to point some distinctive African particular characteristics that you refer to through the book as you go. They'll be a bit random, I'm afraid. It's a bit disconnected, but there are a number of them, at least 10. Number one, Mafeje notices that the political does not align well with the economic in terms of power in Africa. especially because land is not definitive. And so you say he leaves the Marxist language of class and works more with status. That's the first distinctive characteristic. Another one is that customary tenure is distinctive, but not perhaps only in Africa. However, the fact that land is commonly seen as not alienable, inalienable land, creates a particular problem in Africa for title deeds, the solution of imposing title deeds. Another one is that the peasant is a very unique category in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, because they have only use rights, usufructory rights, and do not own the land. Another one is that Mafeje thinks that one of the most useful categories is lineage to understand African social formations, lineage, rather than the category of class. So that's quite unusual. Another one is that South Africa, for instance, is schizophrenic in terms of its gap between communal social tenures and individualistic Western title deeds. Another one is that, number 6, is that elders perhaps do not own land, but control production. This is not credited by Marxists. Another one is that marriage and affinity at the level of the household are more important than sanguinity, bloodline, or filiality. And another one, number 8, is that the bureaucracy, the petty bourgeois comprador bureaucracy, behaves like a producer and owner class. That one rings home. And last of all, there's a series of things he mentions. We're beset in Africa, particularly in the post-independent phase, with foreign monopolies, misalignment between the export industry and local production. We are technologically dependent on foreign suppliers. We have monopolized local markets and high costs because we're export producing, which leads to an imbalance with the informal economy. And we have terribly imbalanced income between the formal and informal sector, which again alienates the bureaucratic government job people from the peasants and the workers. In fact, you say, and I think this is important, that the African petty bourgeoisie is attractive to imperial capital because they're corruptible. And then I think, last of all, it's very important that race is not outstripped by the category of class. So there's a number of things. There's a lot of stuff in there that's way beyond Marxist social science and really appeals to uniquely African characteristics. I think your attention to detail and work on the ground is really admirable, and that's where it goes beyond a Marxian dialectical materialist, historical determinist, idealistic of Hegel. But I did want to ask, perhaps, if you could just, if there's any time, say a few things about how the hell you wrote such a huge book. Is it intimidating? I don't know how. I can't write such books, and find it embarrassing on my part and admirable on yours, perhaps, for some of our people listening, you could share a little bit about how to produce these things. And also one last question, maybe a little bit unfair, but is there a difference between your approach to historiography and that of Nkukai Toby?
Yeah, I don't know Nkukai Toby's work. I mean, I must confess that I haven't yet bought his book on land, or is it on lawyers?
Not really on land.
Yeah, lawyers. That's what I've heard. I think that's part of the reason why I've been reluctant to buy it. But I'm going to buy it now that you asked me this question. I don't know. I will have to read his work for me to know that if there's a difference between what he has to say and myself. With regards to the book, I think.
Just Chris, is that your fan again?
Oh, it's mine. Sorry.
Okay.
If I can jump in there, hey, Thabang had a very good answer, and that's that you think through Africa in African terms.
Yeah, I guess so. And I think the main, I think what I've been trying to do, you see, when people, those who don't write about Mafeje biographically, who tend to focus on his work, tend to isolate different parts of his body of work. So someone would write on his critique of the social sciences, or his critique of the discipline of anthropology, or focus on his work on land, or focus on his work on revolutionary theory and politics. And my argument is that in order to understand these different aspects of his work, you have to go back to his critique of the social sciences themselves, because that's where he lays the foundation as to how we must understand not just theory, but the African societies themselves. And so to show or to demonstrate this, I had to make this connection in the book and take all these different aspects of his work and put them together and show how they can be read as a continuum rather than different and isolated parts of his body of work. And so that's why I had to write such a long book. But also it was based on my PhD thesis, so I had data, as it were, to so that I can be able to produce such a lengthy book. You know.
Do you mind to ask how long it took from you finishing the thesis to writing this book?
I submitted my thesis in 2017, and you know, this makes me angry, but I waited 9 months to get my results. So during that period, I started working on the book before I got my results. You see. Yeah, and I submitted my book proposal during that period. Fortunately, the proposal was accepted within 2 weeks, and so that's.
How did you know where to send the proposal?
I don't know, man. I picked so I chose Wits University Press or UKZN Press and other publishers, but Wits University Press was the first to respond, and I went with them. So I think it took about 6 months to rework the manuscript and submit it to the publisher, and then wait for the reviewers. I think they took about 4 or 5 months.
Is there something is there a major difference between the way you would write a thesis and the way you would write the book? What did you find the biggest difference in terms of what's expected?
I think one of the things that my editor said to me, when you write a book, you are the authority. When you write a thesis, you're trying to prove a point. I mean, This is even in the way you reference, you cite, you have to prove that, listen, I got this from so and so, even though I'm going to discredit it or reinforce it. But but when you write a book, you already know. I think that's yeah.
Okay.
And you don't reference as much, and you also don't cross-reference when you write a book. You take a lot of things for granted. I mean, you don't find me saying, as I've argued in chapter 5. Or, you know what I'm saying? I want you as a reader to know that I've made this argument. Why, going to explain this in a
question of authority.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time you've given to our center to share this with our audience. Hope to catch up with you in Makanda.
Yeah, I'm here. And by the way, I'm from East London, so I go home quite frequently.
Awesome. Well, you just come visit in Cambridge.
All
University
right.
of Cambridge.
Thank you. I think, thanks, colleague. Thanks a lot. Maybe I hear there's a question here, Dr. Nyoka. Where can we get the book? Can you quickly tell us where people can get the book?
The book is available from leading bookstores such as Exclusive Books. It's also available in online stores, Take a Lot, Loot, Amazon, and other independent bookstores. I mean, in Gauteng and the Western Cape, Protea Books, Clark Books in Cape Town. You can find it in other outlets like Bargain Books or even Van Skyke. If they don't have it in their shelves, you can order it. And
okay.
Yeah.
So you got it, people. The book is available, and you can tell just from this brief engagement that there's a lot more that we will find in the book. So we really want to congratulate you, Dr. Bongani Nyoka, for doing such an important intellectual work. And we hope that we will all go out there to get the book so that we can engage you thoroughly. And please, let's cite this important work and let's also read it for our own personal development. But all in all, thanks for joining us. And we wish you a great afternoon.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation and for the thorough and intellectually enriching engagement with the book,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hope to see each other soon in another engagement. Thank you, Dr. Bongani, and thanks, everyone. Thanks, Thabang, and thanks, Chris. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.
Nice one. Thanks, Motsamai. Thanks, Bongani.
Thanks.